It was inevitable that something like this would happen one day. The Book of the New Sun has seduced me like no other. The more I read it, the more I want to understand and share what I've uncovered. Over the years, I've made several YouTube videos on this topic, from standard reviews to 2-hour-long explanation essays. But this, to the best of my ability, this is my ultimate love letter to Gene Wolfe, fans of the book, and those that are looking for answers. This video is divided into distinct parts and additional sub-chapters if needed. Don't worry, all the timestamps are clearly labelled in the description and on the progress bar of the video. You can jump directly to whatever chapter you want, like a synopsis of a particular book or my explanation of the timeline of the series, or you can just watch the video from start to finish. It does have a nice linear flow. You decide. And even though I have put my heart and soul into this project, I feel there is still so much to discover and an eternity of discussion. So please comment below or over on Discord and let's keep this conversation rolling. Here I pause. If you wish to walk no further with me, viewer, I cannot blame you. It is no easy road. Before we peek under the skin of the Book of the New Sun, a very quick history lesson. Gene Wolfe's original plan was to write a short novel called The Feast of St. Catherine, but then the idea, the world, the themes and the story grew to be a bigger novel, a trilogy, a 4-book series, and eventually the completed 5 books that we have today. It's the late 70s. Wolfe was an established author, not a superstar by any stretch of the imagination, but titles like The Fifth Head of Cerberus, Peace, and his short stories had garnered a reputation. Still, he's not successful enough to be writing full-time yet, so all the work on the Book of the New Sun was done around his day job. The first draft was the complete story, roughly what we now have in those first 4 books. The Shadow of the Torturer, the edited revised version, was published in 1980. Then Wolfe settled into a rhythm of revising the next part and publishing the following year. The third and originally final part of the trilogy, The Sword of the Lictor, was so much bigger than the first 2 books, it was remoulded and divided into 2 books. The series was completed with the publication of The Citadel of the AUTARCH in 1983. However, the publisher wanted a sequel. Now, there is a lot of debate why that would be. Was it a cynical cash grab because the original 4 books were quite successful, give the audience what they want? Or did the publisher actually read the books and feel like the series had unfinished business or deserved some answers? Whatever the reason, The Earth of the New Sun was published in 1987. My personal opinion on this book is that it fits the meta-narrative of the original series perfectly. It gives us many answers, but many more questions. Because Gene Wolfe is a genius, he knew exactly how to deliver an extension of the story, expose the blind spots of what we'd just read, and even present it in a slightly different style that suits the narrational circumstances and the journey of the physical memoir itself. To put it bluntly, you need to read The Earth of the New Sun. It's not a sequel, it's not a coda, it's not an afterthought. It's book 5 in a 5-book series. In theory, at least, this should be a relatively simple part of the video. I can just deliver a general overview of the books, leaving all the symbolism, the unreliable narration shenanigans, and the twisty time loop puzzlement for another chapter. But in practice, I think a summary of each book works best if we hold hands through the thickest part of the forest and avoid the big revelations and the recontextualization that future books and a rereading of the series will provide. An example would be explaining the long con of Aegea and Aegialus as it's happening, something which is quite confusing as you're reading it, but is resolved by the end of Shadow of the Torturer, but not explaining the appearance of Apu Punchow at the end of the Claw of the Conciliator, because that doesn't start to make sense until much later in The Earth of the New Sun, and even then it's complicated. Also, the grand scheme of things, like which sea monster is controlling the government, or who the hell put a black hole in the middle of the sun? Yes, really. Or even the finer details of the geography, or what year exactly this is all taking place in, don't need too much explanation in this part of the video. We'll talk about that later. As Michael Andre-Driussi states in his excellent reference book LEXICON URTHUS, the synopsis is Severian's narrative, an abbreviated snapshot of his memoirs, his point of view, and what we garner from that. So obviously, spoilers ahead if you haven't read any of the books, personal interpretations that you are encouraged to disagree with, and a recapitulation for the rest of us. We open at the locked gates to a graveyard. Severian, an apprentice torturer, having just survived a near drowning, is trying to gain access so he can get back to his home at the Torturers Guild. After another apprentice lets him in, they encounter a group of shady characters apparently exhuming a body. One of the grave robbers is a guy called Moidelhoff, a well-known revolutionary, an enemy of the government. Severian saves Moidelhoff's life by killing a guard who was just about to attack him. Moidelhoff gives Severian a coin, and this gesture seems to bond Severian to the rebels' cause. He explains that he's somehow experienced a kind of awakening and will serve Moidelhoff if needed, but he'll stay loyal to the guild and remain a torturer. We then get some very handy world building. We're in this huge sprawling city called Nessus, entirely encircled by a giant metal wall, and we're in South America, almost definitely on the west coast in what used to be the Peru-Chile-Bolivian border region. Probably. Like I said earlier, it's not that important to the story. We also know that we're in the distant future. The sun is dying. And although this does read like a fantasy novel at first glance, we're surrounded by ancient and advanced technology, depending on your perspective. This part of the world, this country if you like, is called the Commonwealth, and it's ruled over by the AUTARCH, the supreme leader who resides in the House Absolute. Severian becomes the senior apprentice and is tasked with monitoring a client, a lady that will soon be tortured, called Thecla. Thecla is the half-sister of Thea, Moidelhoff's lover, making Thecla a pawn in the AUTARCH's resistance against Moidelhoff's revolution. She is a political prisoner. The guildmaster can see that Severian has a soft spot for Thecla, so he sends him off to a brothel that has clone prostitutes, including a clone of Thecla. But that doesn't cool his hot loins enough, and Severian falls in love with Thecla anyway. Having completed his apprenticeship, Severian then becomes a journeyman, and soon after directly witnesses the torturing of Thecla. Breaking the code of the guild, Severian gives Thecla a knife so that she can commit suicide, which she does. His punishment, and for a way for the guild to save face, is to be banished from the city. He's ordered to walk to the distant province of Thrax, where he will become the new lictor, kind of like the boss of the prison. Severian is packed up with a pouch of money, a brown book, a letter to the chief magistrate of Thrax, his Fulligan cloak, blacker than black, striking an imposing figure, and of course, Terminus Est, a beautiful, terrifying, big bastard executioner's sword. We learn that Severian has never actually gone beyond the walls of the city before. In fact, he's never even ever left this part of the city, and he severely underestimates the scale of the place. He thought he would leave through the guarded gate to the north, be strolling through the countryside and sleeping under a tree by nightfall. In fact, we spend the rest of the book wandering through the megalopolis of Nessus. He spends his first night in a lodge house, sharing a bed and a dream sequence with a giant man called Baldanders. No, not like that. They were just the sleeping arrangements. In the morning, he meets Baldander's friend, his partner, his keeper, a weird little fellow called Dr. Talos. Little bit of a reveal here. If you read closely, you can see that Dr. Talos is some sort of robot, or at least an unnatural manufactured creation. The details are well hidden, but it's definitely there. Among other things, Dr. Talos is a playwright, and he's putting together a travelling show, and he thinks Severian would make a perfect addition to the cast. Non-committed, Severian just wanders off. Now, so far in this book, the events and even the motivations of the characters have mostly made sense. Yes, the terminology and the dream sequences have kept us on our toes, but it's probably not the formidable book that most of you were expecting. But from this point forward, the Shadow of the Torturer steps up a gear. Much is unexplained and often inexplicable until later, so hold on tight. Severian goes to a clothes shop because his torturer's outfit is drawing way too much attention and scaring the locals. The shopkeeper, a guy called Agilis, straight away spots Terminus Est. He knows that it's a very valuable sword and he offers to buy it from Severian. Of course, Severian won't sell it at any price, so somewhere between the pages, a long con is concocted. Agilis runs the shop with his sister Agia, who now appears disguised as a city official and serves Severian with a duel to the death with poisonous plants. Although Severian doesn't know who his opponent will be yet, he's been hoodwinked into fighting Agilis, who is obviously a great duelist, and the plan is to kill Severian and take the sword. Agia then returns out of disguise and offers to help Severian prepare for the duel. She knows where to find the poison plant, and she can keep an eye on Severian and the sword. On the way to the botanical gardens, Agia and Severian are involved in a cab race, like two rickshaws whizzing through the streets of Nessus. They crash into a big tent which houses the altar of the Pellerines, a religious sect which is devoted to the Conciliator, a messianic, Jesus-like character. They have a relic, the claw of the Conciliator. The crash smashes the altar, causing chaos. And this is when Agia spots the claw and then slips it into Severian's boot without him knowing. So now she can't be accused of stealing it, and she's hoping to retrieve it later. Then it gets weird. They reach the botanical complex and visit various different gardens. The sand garden warps time. Severian thought he was there for just a few minutes, but Agia said he was gone for hours. There's a room with dimension warping mirrors, some sort of broken portal maybe. The hut in the jungle garden seems to be projecting a window into 20th century Africa. There's a modern day to us plane flying in the sky, and people are reading from the King James Bible. Eventually they get to the Garden of Everlasting Sleep and the Lake of Birds, an underwater graveyard where the poison plant also grows. Severian drops his sword into the lake. He dives in after it, he finds it, and then is helped out of the water by a young woman with amnesia called Dorcas. Another reveal here, Dorcas was a dead body at the bottom of the lake just 2 minutes ago. Was it the magic claw tucked in Severian's boot that resurrected her? Let's keep going. Severian picks the poison plant and then is ferried back across the lake by a guy called Hildegren, who Severian recognises as one of the grave robbers hanging out with Vodulus the other night. This bloke loves hanging around graveyards. Then our new motley crew of Severian the Gullible, Agia the Deceptive Thief, and Dorcas the Clueless Dead Woman walk back into town. After a quick bite to eat in a restaurant in a tree, Severian is escorted to the dueling field, where he comes face to face with Agilus. Severian is killed in the duel. At least that's what everybody thinks, until he sits up all revived and alive. That pesky claw again? This freaks Agilus out, who runs from the field, killing several people with his poison plant in the panic. In a poetic twist of irony, Agilus is sentenced to death, an execution that is performed by Severian, making Aegea his sworn enemy for the rest of the series. After the execution, with Dorcas by his side, Severian assumes that he'll finally be able to leave the city, but then he bumps into Dr. Talos, Baldanders, and a new character called Jolenta. Well, she's not exactly new. We did see her very briefly at a cafe that morning, but I forgot to mention her. Don't worry about it. They all get roped into performing that bloody play. Then the whole troop approach the city gate. They meet an old spaceship sailor called Jonas, who instantly falls in love with Jolenta. The book ends with a confusing kerfuffle in the crowd, breaking out into a violent riot. Severian kills a man, the group are split up, and the story is cut short just as Jonas is explaining something. Then Severian addresses the reader, saying that he has carried us thematically from gate to gate. He writes, "Here I pause. If you wish to walk no further with me, reader, I cannot blame you. It is no easy road." We're left wondering what the hell happened, what does it all mean, and what's on the other side of that city wall. We've jumped forward in time from the end of The Shadow of the Torturer. I think it's about a week or two since the incident at the gate. Severian and Jonas, who are friends now, are in the small town of Saltus. It's certainly far enough away from Nessus to have a different vibe, but it's really just down the road. Severian has figured out that his skills as a torturer and executioner are a commodity. The authorities in Saltus pay him to do what he does, including the execution of a spy of Vodalus. So now we can see that this rebellion reaches beyond the walls of the city, and the Autarch has power outside of Nessus. At the execution, Severian notices his old foe, Aegea, in the crowd. Afterwards, while searching for her, he comes across the Green Man, literally a man with green skin who uses some sort of photosynthesis. He's been held as a slave. Oh yeah, he's also from the future. Severian gives him a tool so that he can escape, and he promises to repay the debt one day. Well, he does actually repay the debt one day. He already knows this because he's from the future. Severian then receives a letter, apparently from Thecla, the woman he loved, the woman he gave a knife to, the woman who committed suicide. "Severian, my lover, I'm still alive. My death was staged as part of a deeper plot. I'm hiding in a mine just outside town. Come and find me and we can ride off into the sunset together. But don't tell anyone about this letter." I'm paraphrasing. So off he goes to the mine, where instead of finding Thecla, he encounters a pack of man-apes who attack him. He escapes by using the power of the claw. Probably. As he's leaving the mine, he's attacked again, this time by the real author of the letter. Of course, it's Aegea and her band of nasty assassins. He escapes with the help of Jonas, and he allows Aegea to go free. Back at the inn, Severian and Jonas are kidnapped by Vodalus's henchmen. They're taken to him, where he asks if they would be willing to join him in his rebellion against the Autarch. They both accept, probably because Vodalus would have killed them otherwise, and then they take part in the initiation ceremony. This involves drinking the blood or the special juice from an alien monster called an Alzabo. The Alzabo has the ability to take on the personality of its prey when it eats them. So if a person drinks this special Alzabo juice and then eats the brain of another human, it can gain their memories and even their characteristics. The effectiveness depends on how susceptible they are to the Alzabo analeptic. This explains why Moidelhoff and his followers are robbing graves. They need brains to eat. Obviously there's a deeper reason, but I'll talk about that much later. Severian is made to eat none other than Thecla. I know this is supposed to be a synopsis, but I just wanted to linger here for a minute and bask in what is the most important pivot point in the story so far. At the start of The Shadow of the Torturer, we are told by Severian that he's writing his account, his memoirs, when he eventually becomes the Autarch. Chapter 1. It was in this fashion that I began my long journey by which I backed into the throne. The reader naturally assumes that although Severian will mature and his character evolve, it will essentially be the same person just writing from the future. Now we learn that the author of the account that we've been reading so far is the mental hybrid of at least Severian and Thecla, and who knows who else by the time he becomes Autarch. This is hands down the greatest, best executed recontextualization of a story that I've ever encountered. It's so tempted to just go right back to the beginning and read it again with this revelation in mind. But we must move forward. Severian and Jonas are given the mission to go to the House Absolute, that's the residence of the Autarch, to deliver a message to a spy. They actually get captured in the grounds and then thrown in the antechamber, a dungeon underneath the House Absolute that holds prisoners of the Commonwealth. The Thecla part of Severian's consciousness has memories of being in the antechamber in the past and knows of a secret door, so Severian and Jonas escape. Among other things, Severian finds his sword, Jonas uses a teleportation device to leave Earth completely, and then Severian bumps into the spy he was looking for all along, who turns out to be the Autarch himself. Back in the garden, Severian is reunited with the old gang of Dr. Talos, Baldandus, Dorcas and Jolenta, who were there to perform that bloody play. The performance is interrupted by aliens in the audience shooting up the place with laser guns, and the gang flee, leaving the House Absolute and hitting the road. The new plan is for Dr. Talos and Baldandus to return home to their castle by the lake, and for Severian, Dorcas and Jolenta to continue along the road to Thrax, where Severian will start his new job. Nasty business now. It turns out that Jolenta was transformed, genetically and surgically manipulated by Dr. Talos to be an object of beauty, probably to create more interest in his play. This almost explains why Jonas literally fell in love with her at first sight, probably some sort of selective pheromone. But now Dr. Talos is done with her and he refuses to take her with them, leaving her withdrawn from whatever drugs he was pumping into her. It gets worse. It's suggested, maybe, that Severian raped Jolenta the night before the play, and she attempts to commit suicide. Back on the road now, and Severian is awakened in the middle of the night by the calling of an undine from the river. It's a big animal fish woman thing that tells Severian that he is meant for greater things and offers him the ability to breathe underwater, which he turns down. Now we get a series of events that are probably the most confusing part of the whole Book of the New Sun. The reader is left perplexed until much later on in the story, so I'll just recount as it happened. The group come across a stone town where there's a character called the Kamaian. She's likely an alien posing as a sorcerer. Her assistant, Merin, who's a witch, and Hildegrin, that's the Vodalari guy that we saw at the graveyard and the lake where Dorcas came back to life. This bunch are performing some sort of seance. All 6 of them perform a summoning of an ancient Incan godly figure called Apu Punchau. When he appears, Hildegrin pounces on him. The orientation of the action becomes very wobbly as Severian finds himself grappling with Hildegrin, but he also sees another Hildegrin apparently fighting an invisible foe. Reality itself is flashing before Severian's eyes. Visions of the ancient past, memories and dreams swirling around in his brain. A crack of thunder brings him back. Hildegren is dead, the Cumaean, Apu Punch-Out and the witch are nowhere to be seen. Dorcas is there, but Jolenta has finally passed away. Once again, Severian addresses the reader, now saying that he's carried us from town to town and we now stand at the gateway to the mountains. Here I pause. If you wish to walk no further with me, reader, I do not blame you. It is no easy road. This video, well, all of our videos actually, cost a lot of time and some money to make. Money that we don't have. You can support this operation by donating on Buy Me a Coffee, which is an online tipping service. Get yourself some merch over at the merch store, or you can join the cult on Patreon and gain access to our exclusive Discord and the podcast, Radio Death Cult. Links to all that good stuff in the description. Thank you so much. A few months after the strange events at the Stone Town, Severian and Dorcas are living in Thrax. Severian fulfilling his professional obligation by becoming the Lictor, the chief officer of the prison. It's not exactly the perfect romance in paradise. Severian has the stress of the job, and Dorcas is starting to recover from her amnesia. There is a scene where she coughs up some round lead stones. These were forced down her throat when she was dead to add ballast, to help weigh her body down in the aquatic graveyard. Eventually, Dorcas remembers enough to realise that her husband and child could still be alive back home, so she leaves Severian and returns to Nessus. The chief magistrate of Thrax gives Severian the task of attending a costume party and eliminating one of the guests. He meets a woman called Syriaca at the party, he has sex with her, and then realises that she's actually the target. He does not follow orders. Knowing that this will enrage the authorities, he plans to leave Thrax, but he's attacked by a fire-breathing salamander. He escapes the city through the sewage system. The middle of the book feels like an odyssey. Severian wanders through the mountains, encountering one enlightening, fantastical event or character after another. He finds a house in the middle of nowhere, home to a family including a young boy called Little Severian and his twin sister Severa. But who's hiding upstairs waiting to attack him? His old enemy Aegea. And then an Alzabo shows up and threatens to kill them all. In the melee, the dad and the daughter are killed by the Alzabo, but with the upper hand, Severian offers a deal to the monster. Leave them alone, and he promises not to hunt him in the future. A truce, a deal is done, and Aegea escapes. Again. After abandoning the house, the remaining members of the family walk through the mountains, with Severian following behind. The family are attacked by a group of zoanthropes, lobotomized madmen. The Alzabo jumps in and kills all the zoanthropes, but only Severian and Little Severian survive. Heading deeper into the mountains, the two Severians come across a village occupied by some wizards, who kidnap Little Severian. Severian is in the middle of fighting a sorcerer's duel to win the boy back when they're interrupted by a giant killer slug. It's worth noting at this point that these regular appearances of weird alien monsters that are trying to kill Severian belong to a space merchant called Heather. He is Aegea's lover. He's using portal mirrors to drop his pets in Severian's path. Very cool. So escaping the wizard's village, they start to climb Mount Typhon, an entire mountain carved into the statue of the once ruler of the land, Typhon. In the statue's lap lies a gathering of old buildings and construction machines, and in one of the buildings, the dehydrated husk of a two-headed body. They climb up to the statue's giant hand to take a closer look at the gold ring on one of its fingers. Little Severian touches the ring and is instantly vaporized. Severian sleeps in one of the buildings. He's kicked awake by a man with 2 heads. It's the body they saw the day before, now revived and alive. Is it that pesky claw doing its magic healing again? This is Typhon, the 1,000-year-old monarch whose image is immortalised on this very mountain. He takes Severian prisoner and escorts him to his lair in the head chamber of the statue. Typhon offers Severian the throne of the earth. I'm not sure how he can offer such a thing, but anyway, Severian kills Typhon by attacking his other head. He climbs down the mountain all the way to Lake Diaturna, where he struts into a village, confident that he has some sort of power or a knack for survival, and demands free room and board. So the villagers drug him, steal the claw and tie him up. They're taking him on a boat across the lake to their master in the castle. That's also where they've delivered the claw. On the way, Severian escapes by igniting some explosives. He's rescued by the people of the floating islands. The new plan is for Severian and the floating island people to assault the castle and try and retrieve the claw. First, Severian will just walk up to the front door and, posing as the Lictor of Thrax, just ask for the claw back or cause a distraction. The front door is answered by Dr. Talos. Come on, Severian. We all knew that Dr. Talos and Baldanders lived in a castle by a lake. The end of the book has a now typical slingshot ending where we get loads of new information, some questions answered, but many more posed. We learned that Dr. Talos is in fact the creation of Baldanders and not the other way around, as it quite often seems. And Baldanders is potentially somehow extremely important to the bigger picture of this story. There are 3 visitors present. That's their spaceship parked on top of the castle. 3 aliens or hierodules. Their names are Ossipago, Barbatus and Famolimus. It's complicated, but just know that the hierodules are experiencing time backwards and they've already met Severian in the future. Their past, of course. They seem to be keeping an eye on Severian and Baldanders, and were in the middle of some sort of negotiation or interview with Baldanders when Severian turned up. Apparently unsatisfied for now, or then, the hierodules leave, enraging Baldanders. He blames the presence of Severian for the unsatisfactory conclusion to the meeting, and he throws the claw from the top of the tower. The floating islanders take this as a sign to advance and attack the castle. When the dust settles, Baldanders has escaped by diving into the lake. Terminus Est is destroyed and Severian finds the claw in the rubble. Without its fancy encasement, Severian can see that the claw is just a simple rose thorn, and he's left doubting its power, his connection to it, and his place in the world. This book is set against the backdrop of the war between the Commonwealth, ruled by the Autarch in the south, and the Askians in the north. The war has always been the backdrop to the Book of the New Sun, but until now it hasn't really affected Severian directly. Severian, once again alone, a few days after the battle at Baldander's castle, finds a dead soldier on the ground. Still uncertain of its power, Severian tries to use the claw to revive him, and hey presto, it seems to work. Groggy and zombie-like, the soldier gets to his feet. As Severian and the soldier make their way to a field medical facility, the soldier's health improves, while Severian declines, so when they do reach help, it's Severian that's taken in. Recovering from his strange fever, Severian meets his fellow patients, a beautiful young woman and 2 men who both want to marry her. The woman decides that the best way to choose a future husband is for the men to have a storytelling contest. In between these stories, which we get to hear in full, Severian is trying to convince various members of the medical staff to take the claw from him, to accept it as the holy relic that it once was, that it still is, apparently. The medical facility is run by the Pellerines, the same religious group that worships the claw of the Conciliator in the first book, the very same claw that Severian still has. This part of the book is full of metaphor and proverbial gymnastics, well, more than usual anyway. The stories that we hear are reflections of the true scope of the narrative, and kind of a nuanced reward for getting this far and paying attention. Another patient joins in the contest. The woman herself tells a story. Severian is the judge. Before we get a conclusion to the contest, the head Pellerine asks Severian to go and rescue a holy man that lives somewhere out in the wilderness that's about to be overrun by the Ascians. He hides the claw in the altar and goes off on his mission. He finds the holy man, Master Ash, at his shack, a place called the Last House. Severian stays the night, sleeping upstairs, and in the morning discovers that the whole world is covered in ice. This is one of the possible futures of Earth. Ragnarok, the final winter. The different levels of the house show Severian the different strands of fate, the alternate futures. He drags Master Ash from the house, who then disappears, and the Ragnarok timeline collapses. This does suggest that the future now favours the Green Man's timeline, where the new sun does come to Earth and produce enough heat and light so that some sort of evolved human can photosynthesize. But we'll cover that in much more detail in another chapter. Severian returns to the hospital and discovers that the Ascians have attacked and completely destroyed the place. He wanders around for a couple of days before joining the AUTARCH's army as a mercenary. Severian is wounded on the battlefield and is inexplicably rescued by the AUTARCH himself. They fly off in a little copter thing and then they get shot down behind enemy lines. The AUTARCH, badly injured, close to death, about to be captured by the enemy, explains to Severian that he is next in line to be the AUTARCH. There's no time to waste. Drink this Alzabo analeptic that hangs in a cock-shaped bottle around my neck. Cut my throat and kill me, then eat my brains so that you can absorb all the memories of all the AUTARCHs that came before me, thus continuing the chain of consciousness transference. This is what the Hierodules told me would one day happen. I've always known that you would be my predecessor. This is your destiny. So Severian kills the AUTARCH and eats his brains. Inexplicably, again, Severian is rescued by Aegea and the Green Man, who opens up a corridor through time and space and drops him on a beach near Nessus. Then we and Severian, because he's now the AUTARCH, get a big revelation from, let's call it an AI projection from an alien computer. The secret history of time is mostly explained to Severian. It's the concept of a divine year, the time span from the Big Bang to the heat death of the universe, or whatever else stops existence before then. The idea of creating a bubble universe so that humanity or another life form can be uplifted so that we can take existence, life, into the next universe, the next divine year. I know it's a lot to take in, so I've dedicated an entire chapter to trying to explain the timeline. But for a synopsis, it's enough that Severian now kind of understands his purpose and his potential. He boards a riverboat and travels upstream to Nessus. He sees Dorcas mourning her dead husband. He visits the Citadel, the prodigal son returns, and then he goes back to the restaurant in the tree, puts two and two together and figures out that the waiter is Dorcas's son, also his father, making Dorcas his grandmother. Nice. The story ends with Severian preparing to leave Earth on a spaceship to go to a pocket universe where he will be judged by a bunch of aliens to see if he is indeed worthy to bring the new sun. Oh, and just before the end, Severian drops the bombshell that he's not the only Severian that walks the corridors of time, and he intends to marry his one true love, Valeria, a character that we met for less than 2 pages at the start of The Shadow of the Torturer. And that's it, the Book of the New Sun. Everything you need to know, all wrapped up in a nice tidy package with a bow on top. No, wait! And so we come to the sequel, the coda. Cynics would say the contractual obligation. It's all of those things, giving us many answers, but so many more questions. 10 years after the end of the Citadel of the Autarch, Severian, now the Autarch, leaves Earth on a spaceship bound for Yesod, a place that exists outside of our time and space. Probably, sort of. The entire first act of the book takes place on the spaceship, and in my opinion, although a lot of amazingly weird and wonderful things happen, they don't have too much bearing on the plot, especially on a first read. But this is where Severian throws his memoirs, the Book of the New Sun, into a wormhole. This is the book that then travels back in time and falls into Gene Wolfe's possession, which he then translates into this book. He also meets a woman called Gunny, who stays by his side for a fair chunk of the book, and he has his penultimate encounter with the 3 Hierodules, Ossipago, Barbatus and Familinus, but it's their second meeting with Severian because they experience time backwards. When we get to Yesod, Severian is then judged to determine if he is indeed worthy, or at least compatible to be the new sun, to be the chosen one. He encounters a hierogrammet, something like that, called Apheta. She is of the species, the beings that were created in the last universe by the people whose job it was to uplift. Remember, we're in the business of ensuring life from one universe to the next. The hierogrammets are observing, monitoring, possibly even guiding and manipulating this process through the Hierodules and God knows who else. Apheta has sex with Severian, creating a white fountain. It's like he's ejaculated a whole new universe, another Big Bang. In simpler terms, this is what travels back to Earth and changes the old dying sun into the new sun. It turns out that Severian wasn't being judged at all. These guys just needed him to create the white fountain so that they could then look into the future and just double check to see if he really is the chosen one, which he is. Time travel logic hurts my head. Severian and Gunny are then, after a few very strange dream sequences and time paradox visions, transported on a spaceship back to Earth. We then get what my friends at Alzabo Soup like to call the Gospel of Severian. Much of what will be written as the story of the Conciliator happens around now.
You gonna help?
Severian heals a little girl's withered arm, rejuvenates a man on his deathbed, and for want of a better phrase, resurrects a zombie. All will be noticed and add fuel to the Conciliator mythos. He's attracting a lot of attention now with his miraculous powers, and he's arrested and thrown in prison in Nessus, right where he used to live and work. He's picked up a few followers along the way, disciples, who visit him in prison. He tells them about his incredible story so far, which is overheard by the guy in the next cell, who then writes it down. This text becomes another Book of the New Sun, the story of the Conciliator. This is the book that Dr. Talos will adapt into his play, Eschatology and Genesis, about 1,000 years in the future. Severian is taken to the ruler of the land, the monarch, and it's Typhon from the Sword of the Lictor. This meeting of the two explains the strange comments by Typhon when he meets Severian in the future. Gene Wolfe, you are a genius. Severian befriends some of the guards who let him go, He then gives one of them the simple rose thorn that he still has in his pocket from the end of the last book. And this is the claw, the relic. It's stuck in a time loop. So he tries to jump back to his own time, but he overshoots a little bit. It's now 40 years after he first left on the spaceship. His wife, Valeria, is now the AUTARCH, and the new sun has arrived, melting the ice caps and causing that biblical flood, effectively ending this universe, this divine year. What? Well, that's the end of the world, the apocalypse. So Severian jumps back into the corridors of time and tries to escape as far back as he possibly can, which is the limits of the new sun's power. And it's the equivalent time of when the White Fountain was conceived, about the 10th or 11th century. I go into this in much more detail in the next chapter. We're now in the time of the pre-Incas, and as Severian is a man from the future, he can uplift the tribespeople by sharing information about things, including building techniques like the keystone. They eventually grow weary of this strange man and they test him. There's a lot of uplifting and testing crossover in this book. When the spaceship that took Severian to Yesod passes in front of the sun, they accept him as their king, the sun god, Inti, Apu Punchau. Now here we have Severian, quite comfortable for many years, teaching these people lots of things from his time, kickstarting a civilization that he will be part of thousands and thousands, if not millions of years in the future. When he's finally had enough, he tries to leave, but he realizes that he doesn't have enough new sun superpower because it's too far away. And then they kill him. Then it gets really weird. He wakes up in his own tomb looking at his own dead body. And those three Hyrule aliens are also there, but this is their last time that they're ever going to meet him, or their first time, backwards time. It turns out that you can become a kind of force ghost if somebody else thinks about you long and hard enough, but you can't physically touch another version of yourself if two of you exist, because then the wave function will collapse and you'll be destroyed or something. This is exactly what we see at the end of the Claw of the Conciliator in that stone town, when there were two Hildegrins, or was it two Severians? I can't remember now. It's typical of Wolfe to throw in a concept that's so complicated but also so satisfactory this late in the series. But it was there all along. Anyway, without the power of the new sun, Severian is stranded in the tomb, just waiting to die. But then the Green Man appears and rescues him by taking him back to the future, just like he said he would in the last book, and just like he said he would twice in the second book. So don't tell me Gene Wolfe didn't have all of this planned out right from the very beginning. This is book 5 in a 5-book series. Severian returns to URTHUS, which is the next Earth. The next divine year? Probably, we think so anyway, where the scraps of humanity have to start all over again. And Severian is considered a living god called the Sleeper. We end the entire series with some wisdom from Severian, our god of many names. And I'm paraphrasing here, but it's pretty much, be excellent to each other. Yes, the Book of the New Sun is actually Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Okay, pay attention. The Book of the New Sun is primarily talking about the span of human civilization from the Incas in the past to the apocalypse in the distant future. Severian is the constant, the somewhat oblivious architect of the whole thing, but also a servant of something much, much bigger. Possibly the biggest expression of space and time in all of science fiction. This isn't to scale, but we can place Severian as Apu Punchau here at the beginning, the furthest point in time that he travels back to, therefore the furthest point that he influences humanity. We can actually pin this down to a rough date. I'm going to say it's about the 10th or 11th century when the pre-Inca tribes started using complex building materials, the keystone, and when they started worshipping the sun god, Inti, Apu Punchal, Severian. The other end of the scale is the period where the plot to the first 4 books takes place, the time of the autarchs, dueling with poison plants, the journey to Thrax, a torturer walking around town with a great big scary sword, all that great stuff, very close to the end of the world. We know the sun is dying, and we also know that hydrogen fusion will slow down and enter its red giant phase about 5 billion years from now. That just feels way too far in the future, even for this story. But there is evidence to suggest that either aliens, advanced humans, or maybe machines have manipulated that natural process, keeping the geological and tectonic scale within grasp. Anything between about 10,000 and a few million years is plenty of time to bury our current age under layers and layers of history, barely recognisable, but not massively detached. The Earth of the new sun floats around the entire timeline and also sometimes takes place in another dimension. Yesod is a place that exists outside of our space and time, but it's also parallel or folded up inside the claw or inside Severian's head or nowhere, I think. And all of this is just a slither of the true scale of what's really going on. The purpose of everything is to continue a chain of universes and take life, existence, into the next divine year. Effectively, a divine year is the cycle of a universe, from Big Bang to heat death, or whatever else stops existence. That's the genius of the scale of the Book of the New Sun. It's concentric layers of consciousness and intelligence, a very human story. But it overlaps into religion, folklore, the unknowable. And from a postmodern perspective, it's rock-hard science fiction that loops back on itself into the divine and everything in between. Let's go back to this scale, the playground of the characters that a human mind can grasp. The journey and the evolution of the physical Book of the New Sun is almost as fascinating as the story itself. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that directly affects its own content, its own existence, and the history of the world that it occupies several times over. Draft number 1. Severian writes his memoirs when he is the autarch, right at the end here. He finishes the book and he puts it in Alton's library in Nessus. Draft number 2, just off the end here, on a spaceship on the way to Yesod, whatever the hell that means, Severian rewrites his memoirs, which must be identical to the first draft because he has a perfect memory. Yeah, right. And then he takes that book and he throws it into a wormhole. I'm not making this up. That book travels back in time. We can't be 100% certain where in space and time that it lands, but we do know that a metafictional version of Gene Wolfe himself finds the book in the 1970s, translates it as best he can, and that's the version of the book that you can now buy on Amazon. And that's why the original story, these 4 volumes, finishes where it does, because Severian hadn't yet completed his Odyssey. Now it gets really interesting. When Severian travels back from Yesod to about 1,000 years before his own birth, the time of the first autarch, he's held prisoner and he recounts his tale so far to a cellmate. That guy thinks, what a great story, and he adapts Severian's account into another Book of the New Sun, this time leaning the emphasis more into the tale of the Conciliator, this saviour figure, which is of course Severian. And that's where you get the parallels with Jesus, the Bible, Christianity. By the time we pick up the story in Shadow of the Torturer, which is in the future at this point, Severian is unwittingly living in a world of his own legend. This is also the Book of the New Sun that centuries later Dr. Talos will further adapt into his play Eschatology and Genesis. So yes, in essence, that play is a warped version of this timeline that we're only halfway through witnessing when we get to see it performed. The Earth of the New Sun is yet another memoir written by Severian after all these events have happened, but I'm not entirely sure how this got back to Gene Wolfe from what is effectively the next divine year, a whole other universe. I guess Severian moves in mysterious ways. The other mega important aspect of this timeline, as well as it being a map of Severian's influence on this universe, it's also the span of influence of the new sun itself, the actual star, and how the two of those are intrinsically linked. Right, let me think about this and try and get it right. When Severian creates the new sun in Yesod, which is technically outside of our space and time, it still takes a finite amount of time for the sun to physically travel to Earth. It takes this amount of time. It arrives 50 years after Severian left on the spaceship, 50 years after the end of Citadel of the AUTARCH. Let's work back to front on this one. When the new sun arrives, it melts the ice caps, it causes that biblical flood, and it wipes out humanity. I think this is the end of this divine year, from Big Bang to the point when it arrives. Well, technically, I think it's the start of the transition into the next divine year, but let's not go there. Severian gets in a little bit of trouble round about here, about 1,000 years before the start of Shadow of the Torturer. He's held in a prison cell and he escapes by jumping back in time as far as he possibly can. Now we know that this ability is powered by the new sun, so now we know its limits. The new sun must have been born in Earth equivalent time around the 10th or 11th century, around the time of the pre-Incas. So that's why Severian can't jump all the way back to the time of the dinosaurs or the Big Bang or into another universe or divine year. The new sun must be in existence. It must be in the sky somewhere. It's not explicitly explained, but it is suggested that the new sun gives Severian more power the closer it gets to Earth. Either that, or he just learns to harness the power better as he gets older. It's complicated. Either way, the physical new sun in the sky is like the book's magic system. If you read closely, you'll see that Severian dies about 15 times in the book. He brings a dog back to life, he pulls Dorcas from a watery grave, and loads of other miraculous things. Gene Wolfe double bluffs and sometimes triple bluffs us into thinking that the power was coming from the claw of the Conciliator. But it was Severian and the new sun all along. But then again, Severian is the Conciliator, and he could have transferred that power into the claw at any time, or it could have been a bit of both. It's a paradoxical Dumbo's feather. Beyond the rigid structure of the timeline lies interpretation for the plot and for every reader's personal experience. Even when Gene Wolfe writes or translates The Earth of the New Sun, which is arguably a book that solves many of the mysteries of the original vision, he just expands the horizons and gives us even deeper questions. Is divine intervention moulding this timeline above the hierodules? Is this a story about God's plan? It's certainly proposed, but it's not a requirement. Or is this a story about the nature of infinity, and Severian just happens to be the character that stumbles through history in just the right way? Keep an eye on 1 trillion galaxies, a googolplex of suns, and somebody will eventually appear miraculous or divine. You don't need to understand the timeline. You don't need to understand the Book of the New Sun. We love this book because we are forever searching for meaning. Theories, symbols and postulations. This is the part of the video that I've been both looking forward to and dreading in equal measure. It's an opportunity for me to present an amalgamation of years of obviously reading the book, listening to Book of the New Sun podcasts, piggybacking very smart people's work, and simply discussing the book with other fans. I think it's important to note that pretty much every crumb of speculation and interpretation has been publicly debated and recorded many, many times. It's the perfect book for that. But the nature of the unreliable narration and the often cryptic delivery of the text means that opinion and interpretation holds more currency than cold, hard fact. And it's a lot more fun. However, there is still a relatively solid consensus on most of the mysteries, which I will try my best to deliver. Please, if you disagree or you have something to add, comment below or over on our dedicated discussion channels on Discord. We need all the help we can get. Even the most casual reader of the Book of the New Sun, if that's even a thing, will surely notice the parallels between Dr. Frankenstein and his monster and Dr. Talos and Bullanders. Yes, Wolfe subverts the reader at first by presenting Dr. Talos as the brains and Bullanders as the lumbering oaf, but we soon learn that Bullanders is the creator. Let's assume that Gene Wolfe is doing something far more elaborate than simply referencing Frankenstein, and let's talk about the concept of the information echo, influencing the past by way of time travel. We know that Severian travels back in time and creates his own mythos, his own gospel. He is that very same conciliator that he's heard about at the beginning of The Shadow of the Torturer, or he will be in his subjective future, which is actually the linear past. Another great example is when he travels back to the 10th or 11th century and teaches the pre-Inca tribes construction techniques from the future, uplifting this slice of humanity, which in itself is a microcosm of the divine year white fountain idea. But let's not get distracted. The point is, his actions in the past must affect everything after, like the butterfly effect. He spent quite a few years with the tribe, so who knows what stories he told, what information he dished out, just how much did he mould that timeline? Is the entire saga built on Severian's foundational echo? Back to Frankenstein, Severian as Apu Punchau, who is a living god to his tribe, remember, is telling stories about a funny little android playwright and his giant companion. Surely the word of God is recorded, revered and repeated. I understand that the Promethean Greek myth involves creating humanity from clay and has heavy uplift themes, which is the true deep inspiration for Shelley's Frankenstein, but the image of the creator and the monster still tracks. There is room for all of these origins to exist concurrently in the Book of the New Sun. Prometheus, Frankenstein, Dr. Talos and Bullanders, and Severian as the creator and the uplifter of his tribe and beyond, making Severian the modern Prometheus, which makes Frankenstein the postmodern Prometheus. And that's just the example of Frankenstein. There may be 100 more examples buried in the text by Gene Wolfe, just waiting to be discovered. It doesn't stop there. As we've now established that going back in time creates echoes of influence, we can conclude that any time traveller can manipulate the timeline, not just Severian. The Green Man has the ability to walk the corridors of time and, I think, doesn't necessarily need the presence of the new sun to power that ability. Indeed, he rescues Severian from his Apu Punchau tomb when Severian doesn't have enough new sun power to time travel himself out of trouble. The Green Man's physical nature is due to him coming from the very far future, or maybe just one possible future that is yet to be determined. Does this mean that the Green Man and others like him, the Hierodules and the Hierogrammates, can play with time, history and fate at will and this story is just one of an infinite number of possible scenarios. Talking of things stuck in a time loop, the claw of the Conciliator, not the book, the actual claw, is the perfect example of Gene Wolfe's playfulness, his version of the puzzle box, how symbols have power, and the double, the triple, and the quadruple bluff. On a reread of the Book of the New Sun, it's the claw that exposes Severian's miraculous ability, because by then the reader understands that the claw is just a simple rose thorn. In my opinion, it also exposes just how much control Wolfe had of the narrative. We're deep into the Earth of the New Sun before the claw is elevated to relic, when Severian gives the rose thorn covered in his own blood to a soldier, right after he heals and resurrects people, and right before he jumps into the corridors of time. About 1,000 years later, the time of the Shadow of the Torturer, the Pellerines care for the claw, which is now entombed in a nice shiny gem. All sorts of allegory and symbolism there. When we pick up the story, why wouldn't we mirror Severian and attribute power to the claw? Wolfe guides us down that path. Pay attention. He resurrects a dead woman. He survives a fatal alien plant attack. Oh, he didn't realise that he had a magic claw tucked in his pouch the whole time. I solved a Wolfe puzzle. Then Severian discovers the claw and joins the reader in that assumption. It guides his actions and emotions for a big chunk of the story. He forms an assault squad to retrieve the claw from Baldander's castle. He wrestles with the realisation that it was just a shiny gemstone, and he still believes in the healing powers of the claw, even though the Hierogals and the Pellerines tell him that it was never a magic relic. But it gives him confidence and inner strength, and it masks the true, somewhat supernatural power of the new sun, like a divine placebo. Symbols have power. The claw is Severian's Dumbo's feather, but it's also a perfect science fiction time loop paradox artifact, right up there with Donnie Darko's jet engine and the Terminator's hand. Hopefully, we all understand that the Book of the New Sun is a work of fiction, therefore taking place in its own bubble of space and time. However, it's fun and interesting to look for clues that link the book to our real world. Try to fit the fictional narrative into a specific place and time. One of the first clues that this is the far future of our Earth is a painting hanging in the Citadel in Nessus. It's pretty clearly the famous Apollo 11 mission, Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon. But it's kind of suggested that this isn't common knowledge. I'm not sure if that's saying that this is so far in the future that the greatest events in human history are almost forgotten, or that Severian has lived such a sheltered life that he hasn't been exposed to that information. Let's be honest, there are lots of people that could name you all of the Kardashians, but don't know who the hell Neil Armstrong is. So, inconclusive time frame, but let's agree that it's our Earth in the future. Talking of the moon, it's now a green disk in the sky. It's covered in trees and much closer to Earth. That's the opposite of what our current understanding predicts. This doesn't help pin down a date, but it does illustrate that we're so advanced that we've learnt how to terraform and, pull the moon closer? There are references to a technological golden age, which happened sometime between now and the time of the book, where humans travelled to 1,000 star systems and conducted business with alien races. It seems we repeated the atrocities of the old empires and the conquistadors, and we're now being pinned back by the galactic community. There are still star sailors and some off-world shenanigans, but as a species, we are doomed to go down with the sun itself. And that sun, the sun, is big and red and about to die.
something that won't happen naturally for a few billion years yet, which is way too far in the future even for this book. We have an explanation that links all of this together. The hierogrammates put a black hole in the middle of the sun, speeding up the process. This was to punish us and to keep us under control. But now they've realised that a human on Earth is needed to take life into the next divine year. So to kill two birds with one stone, they provide the means to save humanity and the entire universe by positioning an autarch as the saviour, who then brings the new sun to Earth. And this rather complicated, often overlooked, mind-blowing science fiction concept is the heart of the Book of the New Sun. Without the cosmic chain of events that take place millennia before the Book of the New Sun, there is no story to tell. None of this helps us date the events in the book. If aliens are throwing around black holes and possibly moving moons, then this is no longer a calendar of human progress. I'm happy with anything from about 10,000 years in the future, because we do still see the traditional archaeological layering of civilizations, and about 1 million years. The geography. Okay, it's almost universally agreed among Wolfe fans and scholars that Nessus, the Commonwealth, the setting of the book, is in South America. There are loads of speculative maps online, almost all showing the familiar position of the Andes, the Amazon, the equator, and Nessus on the west coast, where the borders of our modern-day Bolivia, Peru, and Chile converge, putting Nessus somewhere near the city of Tacna. That would make Lake Titicaca, Lake Diaterna, where Baldanders and Dr. Talos live, and La Paz could be Thrax. It's important to consider that these towns are not necessarily the future versions of our current day towns, but also human settlements exist in geographically favourable locations. So La Paz could indeed be Thrax, even if it is 1 million years in the future. There is yet more evidence that we're in South America when we see references to certain plants and animals, even customs and language. Apu Punchau being the biggest flashing light. I don't think the time frame affects the geography all that much. Forests, rivers and deserts change quite quickly, but a continent doesn't move very far in 1 million years. And of course, we have alien forces at play that can manipulate all of that as well. One thing that throws me off slightly, and even starts to derail some of my own theories if I think about it too much, is the stone town where Apu Punchau appears at the end of the Claw of the Conciliator. If Severian travelled back to the 10th century where he influenced the pre-Inca tribes, and the stone town is the ruins, the place where he once lived, there wouldn't be any trace of it after 1 million years, would there? So either the time of Apu Punchau is much further in the future from now, another time when civilization needed lifting up, so post-apocalyptic, but still clinging on to the imagery and the embers of the Incas. Or the events of the Book of the New Sun take place not many thousands of years from now. I favour this timescale because there is tantalising evidence, and it means I haven't wasted half of this video.
This video, well, all of our videos actually, cost a lot of time and some money to make. Money that we don't have. You can support this operation by donating on Buy Me a Coffee, which is an online tipping service. Get yourself some merch over at the merch store, or you can join the cult on Patreon and gain access to our exclusive Discord and the podcast, Radio Death Cult. Links to all that good stuff in the description. Thank you so much.
Jonas and Jolenta. Why would I dedicate an entire chapter of this video to two characters that we don't spend very much time with and who arguably don't affect the story all that much. Arguably, I stress. The details of who they are great examples of informing the reader of the wider universe, the layers of technology, and just how different and weird this future Earth can be. This is one of my favourite aspects of Wolfe's storytelling, how he dictates a much grander narrative through the lens of a memoir, without heavy info dumps and clunky exposition. Jonas latches onto the narrative in the last few pages of The Shadow of the Torturer, instantly declaring that Jolenta is the most beautiful woman that he's ever seen. He is in love, and I believe him. Well, I believe that he believes it. More on that in a minute. His story is amazing, and one that I wish Gene Wolfe would have dedicated an entire novel to, like many of the side stories in the Book of the New Sun. Jonas was maybe 100% machine, a walking, talking AI when he was originally built by the Koreans, probably. I have to say probably and maybe because it's not crystal clear if he was part organic. And the Korean origins comes from when he talks about his original given name and the ship that he served on. He was a spaceship operative who left Earth during the First Empire. This is the period when humanity spread out to 1,000 stars, very much a golden age, the height of our technological powers, before the aliens pegged us back for being too aggressive. He returned to Earth, we think, about 200 years later, but I suspect that time dilation has played its hand, and it's much later than that, because the spaceport that he intended to dock at isn't there anymore. Let's assume that that spaceport was originally in Nessus. And let's also assume that the ruins of that spaceport became part of the Citadel. The Metachin Tower, where Severian lived and worked as a torturer, is an old rocket, as are many of the buildings in Nessus. That may all be completely wrong. He may have been aiming for a completely different city. He may have crash landed 10,000 years ago and has only just now made his way to Nessus. But I like the assumption. It's elegant. And more importantly, it means that Wolfe is rewarding us for paying attention. Anyway, Jonas is severely injured, or whatever it is that happens to machines when they crash, and he repairs himself using the flesh and the bones and the organs of a human that was killed in the same incident. I love that switcheroo of the usual humans repairing themselves with artificial parts trope. We arrive at the same philosophical question, where does the machine stop and the human start, but from the opposite side. Jonas seems to have absorbed some personality and memories from the dead man, making him a true human-machine hybrid, drawing comparisons with the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz, Blade Runner's replicants, and take your pick from science fiction history. In my opinion, Jolenta is that same expression of the human artificial portmanteau, but now we explore that concept from a much darker angle. Darker than harvesting a human to make a machine feel better. Dr. Talos finds a waitress in a cafe and offers her the chance to become the most beautiful woman in the world, and she takes the plunge. What could possibly go wrong? Off camera, Talos conducts transformational surgery, probably some horrible futuristic genetic engineering, and he gives her outward beauty, every red-blooded man's desire, and I suspect advanced pheromones as well. And then he renames her Jolenta. She suffers extreme exploitation. She's the eye candy in Dr. Talos's play, and totally reliant upon the drugs that are keeping her beautiful, keeping her body alive after the transformation. She's a rape victim, the focus of disproportionate infatuation, discarded and beaten by the one who gave her the curse, and then she commits suicide. Did Jonas fall in love due to a simple chemical reaction, a kindred understanding of a similar predicament, or is this a platform to explore the male gaze? It can, of course, be all of those things and more. Here's an interesting observation. Well, I think so anyway. If the cover artwork for the Book of the New Sun featured a tentacled Lovecraftian monster fighting a winged angel, it probably would have sold more copies, and technically that's quite accurate. The war between the Commonwealth and the Askians is not only the window dressing, the backdrop to the whole series, it's also a very important driver of the plot and the action. We just don't see that much of it because obviously we're following Severian, and he doesn't come into direct contact with the conflict until the Citadel of the Autarch. But Gene Wolfe still wants to tell us that story, so he elegantly, brilliantly leaves details sprinkled all over the series. So here is my cobbled together overview of the situation and the far-reaching ramifications. At some point in Earth's history, a gang of aliens, or more likely the seed or the eggs of these aliens, lands on Earth. There is a line somewhere about somebody casting some beans into the sea or something like that. I think Jonas tells that story. There were 17 of them, referred to in a book that we spot in Alton's library called Lives of the 17 Megatherians. Monsters. Alien monsters. I'm not sure if all of them are sea monsters specifically, or how many of them are still alive around the world, but there are at least a handful still active, including a buyer. As big as a mountain and with a harem of undines doing his bidding. Yet another corner of this book that would make a fantastic individual novel. As far as I can tell, a buyer wants some sort of control of the Commonwealth, possibly the entire world, maybe with the other sea monsters, or maybe he just wants to be the king of the earth. He has raised an army, or at least he already has control of the area north of the Commonwealth, probably North and Central America. These are the Askians. He must also know about the Severian situation to some degree, that he will possibly become the new sun and take Earth into the next divine year, scuppering Abaya's plans for world domination. We see quite a few cases of these undines, big, weird female fish servant things, travelling upriver, invading Severian's mind, trying to manipulate him, trying to get him on their side, or maybe even kill him. It's more complicated than that, of course it is. Abaya represents one possible future of humanity, one ideology, where all humans are the same. The Askians are like clones, brainwashed to do the same, to be the same, and to think the same. Conversely, the Autarch program, instigated and manipulated by the Hierodules and the Hierogrammates, is the opposite. They are taking hundreds of humans, all of humanity, and putting it all into one person using the Alzabo analeptic technique. You eat the brains and you absorb all of the autarchs that came before. And that's why it's okay for a torturer to become the saviour, because he has a soldier, an accountant, a beekeeper, a YouTuber, a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker in his brain, in this chain of consciousness. Two sides to a war, two competing opposite ideologies, and humanity caught in this proxy crossfire. Yes, it's a little bit like Star Wars. The Empire has a clone army, disposable people with no heart, while the Rebel Alliance is a dynamic bunch comprised of many colours, creeds, and alien races. I'm not giving George Lucas any credit for the Book of the New Sun. In literature and film, we see examples of the unreliable narrator all the time, but the magnitude at which it affects the story depends on the intent of the writer. It can be a part of the story itself right from the very beginning. The reader or the viewer is aware that the person who is telling us the story is not always telling the truth, the fictional truth, but their inconsistencies are consistent, the tall tale. Sometimes it's used as a plot device or a twist. We find out at the end of the story that this character is in fact somebody else, or they may be mad, or have a problem with memory or something like that. And then there is the kind of narration where the narrator thinks they are telling us the truth, but they have a limited worldview. They may be a child, or oblivious, or stupid, or they may be a dog or a rabbit. One thing that all of these have in common is the observer is privy to the fact that the narration is unreliable at some point. And then Gene Wolfe comes along and gives us Severian, who claims that he has a perfect memory, a pretty useful gift for someone who is writing their rather complicated memoirs. Let me address that phrase, perfect memory, because I think it's often misconstrued. I don't think it means the same to us as it means to Severian. Do we think of a photographic memory when we hear perfect memory? So there should be no mistakes or contradictions. Unless, of course, Gene Wolfe made a mistake when he was actually writing the book and his editor also missed it. But we see contradictions, we see mistakes. For example, Severian names two characters in one scene, and then a few pages later, he gets one of the names wrong. Not that perfect. This could be deliberate by Wolfe merely to make us pay attention. I tell you that he has a perfect memory, and then I show you that either he doesn't or something else is going on. The truth is, many things are going on. And top of that list is Gene Wolfe is translating this book as best he can. Severian is writing this in what must be a very warped language from the future, so nothing will ever be 100% accurate. Severian is not the most wholesome. He's not the best example of how to conduct one's business. In fact, he's very likely a murdering rapist. If you're writing your autobiography, you have the power to bend the truth at will. He does leave in plenty of details about the awful things he's done, but you can also tell when he's been vague, probably because he's ashamed of his actions, or when he's exaggerating, when he was particularly brave in a certain situation, or just how much the ladies loved him. Remember, he's writing this from the position as autarch. He may have to leave out some details, either to protect himself or the Commonwealth. And most glaringly, by the time he's writing this version of the Book of the New Sun, he's consumed the memories and personalities of about 1,000 other autarchs. Maybe that, through translation, is what a perfect memory means to Severian. He has an ability, better than anyone else in the text, to absorb and retain the memories and experiences of dead people, using the Alzabo analeptic. Pass the real story through all of those filters: opinion, perspective, language, time, propaganda, translation, and bullshit, and the fact that it's coming from a pseudo-schizophrenic brain, and you bet it's unreliable. One final note on this. Of all the details that Severian gives us about the world, the characters, and the story, it's what he leaves out that I find particularly fascinating. He marries Valeria, his one true love, and he rules the Commonwealth for 10 years with her by his side, but he barely mentions her in the book. Granted, we don't really get any of the action from those 10 years, but his sudden declaration of love and the lack of word count surely means something. Was she the one woman that he truly felt something for? Or was her position as consort to the autarch the reason for her absence? Or did he fear that she would one day read his memoirs, or something else entirely? The question is left hanging. Anybody that has read the Book of the New Sun will surely have something to say about that bloody play, Eschatology and Genesis. I found it very confusing and quite jarring the first time I read it. So we're actually going to read this entire play within the book. Yes, well, until it gets interrupted. Now I know that it's a warped version of the Book of the New Sun, told by Severian when he was the conciliator, recorded and then adapted by Dr. Talos when he read it about 1,000 years later. Time travel, innit? So upon repeated readings, I think the play is a really interesting comment on the passing of information, sacred texts in particular. And it's a double meta headspin of the book that we're reading, a Russian doll of storytelling.
Do I understand the play? Yes, to my satisfaction, I do understand the play.
The play is relatively easy to understand. It's what happens when a cheeky android who apparently has a good understanding of theater history from the Greeks up to the Elizabethan Jacobean era tries to write a play that aggrandizes his master and at the same time does a satirical takedown of the current leader of Earth.
People have a lot of theories about it. I think he has set it up, Gene Wolfe has set it up so that we are, on the first read, we are led to believe it is this vaudeville comedy take on the Bible.
And therefore a candidate for the epitome of it, not knowing that he's cast somebody in the play who happens to be the author of the religious text that he's based this play on, after that guy goes thousands of years into the future and then gets transported from another world back thousands of years into the past to write said religious text. So he doesn't even know that he's acting in that play as he performs pivotal roles in it on the stage.
I mean, the title of the play is Eschatology and Genesis. So we take that as meaning this is the end of things, like Book of Revelation and Genesis. So it's almost like the record just starts over again, when it's not supposed to, but it has.
Or you might be asking, is this the actual Book of the New Sun, which is referenced by the title of the series? Or perhaps you're thinking this is like the true history of the Conciliator. There's all these options, but none of them quite fits right, and Wolfe delays all the way past the normal ending of the book out into the coda, and that's when we finally get it and it becomes understandable. So it's no wonder that it has this reputation for being difficult. It's on first attack, it really is something else, but he put in the answer for us. We're quite lucky.
And it's not until you read the fifth book, Earth of the New Sun, that you realize how much was actually being foreshadowed.
Then you throw in the fact that there are some aliens watching it who do know all of this context, and that Baldander starts to glean onto it while the play's happening and decides to attack them because he thinks they're making fun of him, and you really understand that it's been right in front of you the whole time.
It's not that Severian is the new Noah. Severian's the angel of the flood. Severian's the angel of destruction.
This one is quite fun on subsequent rereads once you know what you're looking for, if indeed your idea of fun is searching for clues of certain death. We have established that in all likelihood, Severian uses the power of the new sun to perform the miraculous, miracles, like jumping through time and healing the sick and resurrecting people, even animals and himself. From a first read through, I think the most obvious case is when Severian is struck down by Agilus with a poison plant. He then seems to shake off death and sit up, looking a little bit confused, freaking out Agilus, who is convinced that a bite from the poison alien plant should have been fatal, which it was. Those paying attention and quickly adjusting to the strangeness of the shadow of the torturer would have also noticed that he brings his dead dog back to life. And then there's Dorcas. 1 minute a dead woman, and the next She's pulling Severian from the lake of birds. The Book of the New Sun is riddled with miracles, or manifestations of the new sun's power. Lights appearing out of nowhere, storms being summoned in anger, and even turning water into wine. Typical for Wolfe, some are obvious, some are very well hidden, and some are double bluffs, because he knows that we're now looking for them. How many did you spot? How many did you just imagine? There are two examples that differ from the rest when Severian is resurrected as an aquaster, one of the more esoteric concepts in the Book of the New Sun. An aquaster, according to the lexicon URTHUS, is a being created and sustained by the power of imagination and the concentration of thought. This is one of the examples where the book feels like it doesn't have enough scientific foundation to explain what's going on in layman's terms. Ghosts being created by somebody's thoughts. But I trust Wolfe enough that this is just futuristic alien tech that the human mind can't comprehend. I'm fine with that. It seems that if Severian dies when he doesn't have access to the power of the new sun, the Hierodules step in and resurrect him, because they need him to complete his mission. Once, when he falls down a shaft on the spaceship on the way to Yesod, because he's outside of the time and space that the new sun actually exists. And then again, when he's Apu Panchal, he's killed by the tribespeople. I think what's happened is he's overshot his mark a little bit and travelled a little bit too far back in time to just before the White Fountain is created in its relative timeline. So no new sun power. Both times he dies, he sees another version of himself, the dead Severian, because he is the aquaster created by the Hierodules. He will eventually become solid again through the power of imagination and the concentration of thought. I'll be amazed if I got all of that right. For such a major parallel, the Book of the New Sun with the Bible, I find it almost impossible to answer the question, is Severian the Messiah? This is like the Bible, the uncomfortable truth. What if the chosen one was a complete arsehole? Or what if we completely flipped the biblical foundation? Jesus was God personified in man, whereas Severian is man ascending to godhood. He's not the Antichrist either, it's the opposite. Humanity is far from perfect, and he's reaching for the divine. That's his odyssey, I suppose. Also bear in mind that this is how Severian wants to be perceived. Remember, he's writing his memoirs, his own gospel. This suggests that if this is a new religious text, one that actually happened or will happen one day in the future, it's a presentation of what humanity is rather than what we should be. I see this as both a rejection of traditional religion and submitting to a greater power. And Wolfe leaves plenty of room for some version of God. And he ends the whole saga with, "Be excellent to each other." I could proselytize for hours if you allowed me. That's the beauty and the stunning achievement of the Book of the New Sun. Every page, every character, everything we witness can provoke a deep discussion. Personally, I feel I have a pretty firm grip on what actually happens in the story. I think I understand a fair amount of the analogy, the metaphor, and the symbolism. I'm no expert, but yeah, I can talk about this book with some confidence. I've accepted long ago that the mega concepts of the divine year, the possibility that a pan-creator is looming over the whole book, or the proposal that all of this is just the ramblings of a gibbering madman, is all just part of the experience. But there is still something, a feeling of unfinished business, a fundamental piece of this puzzle that I still struggle with. When I think about time travel within this book, I've always seen it as a fairly standard plot device. Severian has absolutely altered reality, but it could have been so much more complicated. The way Wolfe presents it reduces the effects to clever revelations and the odd aha moment. The time travel elements and their consequences feel more like accidents rather than him exploiting that power, except when the Hierogals step in. I see the timeline of Apu Punchau to Yesod, or Ushas, the New Earth, as a timeline that's set in stone, and it's just us and Severian that floats around. Coincidences and odd things happening are half explained by the nature of the narrative. We can never truly believe what Severian says. However, what melts my brain every time I think about it, and potentially upsets this entire video project, is the idea that this is not the first Severian. This isn't buried in the text. He even says it out loud at the end of the Citadel of the Autarch. He even assumes, probably correctly, that the first Severian has already completed the mission. He became the Autarch and he bought the new sun. And it was him that built the mausoleum with the rose, the spaceship, and the white fountain carved on it. So what we're actually reading is a timeline that's already happened, but is now populated by more than one Severian and is being manipulated by him and other agents. Not only is that totally awesome, but I also think Wolfe has crafted yet another layer to this book. One that is true and vital, but somehow hardly ever mentioned. It's also a commitment to those science fiction roots and the biggest headspin of the entire saga, and it was hiding in plain sight. May I add that no matter how much you understand of all of this, or how much of it actually happened, it adds yet another theme to the story, one of identity. Will this miraculous protagonist ever figure out his place in the universe, or who he is, if different versions of himself keep butting in? I need to read the whole thing again. You see, it's not just Bill and Ted be excellent to each other, it's also, hey Jude, take a sad song and make it better. I don't get it.
Hello, BookTube! Welcome to a special slice of Media Death Cult nostalgia. The purpose of this video is to cover as many angles and aspects of the Book of the New Sun as I possibly can, explore the many layers, while also keeping it relatively approachable. But I think there's also room for a standard old school book review, the details of which will be inevitably sprinkled all over this video, but encapsulated here for your convenience. Spoilers ahoy if you haven't read any of the books before, but let's be honest, a book review without a few spoilers is just a waste of everybody's time. The Book of the New... Ladies and gentlemen, the Book of the New Sun. Just to clarify, I am including the Earth of the New Sun. The Earth of the New Sun in this review. You can all argue amongst yourselves whether it's a coda, a true sequel, or something that the publishers forced Gene Wolfe to write. I don't give a shit. It's book 5 of a 5-book series, disjointed by a metafictional wormhole. This is actually quite refreshing. I talk about and think about this book on a daily basis, and during the research of this video my brain has been flooded with details and nuances. It's nice to just talk about this in a simple lump. My history with this thing is I first read it about 20 years ago. You know what, I don't think I even finished Earth of the New Sun. I can clearly remember most of The Shadow of the Torturer for some reason, But then I just have flashes of interesting scenes from some of the other books. The main thrust of the narrative was completely lost. Over the years I read the odd chapter or paragraph just to experience the prose, but it was something that I left on the back burner and intended to return to one day. I had a big plan of reading the whole thing back to back, doing a ton of research and really nerding out. And now I've done exactly that. I read the whole thing about 5 years ago, and then again when this channel hosted a full read along in 2020, what year was it, Charlie? 2022, 2023, sometime around then. Please understand that this is a dream come true for me, to have a platform where I can make videos and share my reading experience, introduce new people to Gene Wolfe, and virtually hang out with other Book of the New Sun enthusiasts. Yeah, we rock. This video, well, all of our videos actually, cost a lot of time and some money to make. Money that we don't have. You can support this operation by donating on Buy Me a Coffee, which is an online tipping service. Get yourself some merch over at the merch store, or you can join the cult on Patreon and gain access to our exclusive Discord and the podcast, Radio Death Cult. Links to all that good stuff in the description. Thank you so much. I used to start these reviews with the plot. The plot! The plan was to divide the video up into the plot, the writing, and some sort of wrap-up explanation thing to avoid a scattergun of verbal diarrhea. Is that still the plan? I will endeavour to do that, but please forgive me if I keep sloshing over the sides and jumping around those categories. It's all interlinked. Okay, so the plot. In its purest form, if I was to explain what's going on with one single sentence. In the distant future, the sun is dying, and one man has the ability to bring light and warmth back to Earth by delivering a new sun. It's right there in the title. And that man, or boy, is an apprentice torturer called Severian. He's our main character. I don't think we ever leave his side or his perspective, because he's telling this story of his own life from a point in his future. Occasionally the narrative will take a detour through other poems or short stories, but they're either being read by Severian to someone else, or he is present when someone else is reading them. They're part of the scene and important to the plot, I think. The grand arc of saving the planet and fulfilling a destiny on a universal scale doesn't really become apparent until you've finished the entire series. It's not written as, once upon a time there was a time-travelling messiah who triggered the mechanism to ensure that life would continue in the next universe beyond the heat death of all matter. Instead, the story focuses on the geographical journey of Severian as he embarks on this Odyssey-like trip, mostly unaware of where he's going or what the hell's going on. We know right from the beginning of the book that Severian will one day become the Autarch. It's like the emperor of the land, the highest seat of authority in this part of the world. So he's writing what we're reading as the Autarch, the current Autarch, the future Autarch. I love how this gives us some sort of destination to aim for in chapter 1. Gene Wolfe is very aware that we're about to be quite confused, so he creates this invisible force that pulls us through the story. He's in complete control of our reading journey. The plot. Concentrate. Severian helps a woman who is being held, awaiting torture in the guild's tower. He slips her a knife so she can commit suicide. He's banished from the city of Nessus. This is the place where he was born, the city that he has never left his entire life. His punishment, probably to save face for the Torturers Guild, is to walk to the far off city of Thrax, where he will become the new torturer. He kind of got away with it. He's just been transferred. To cut a long story short, very short, because you've all read these books before, haven't you? And I've covered this in much more detail in the synopsis part of this video. It takes 2 books to get to Thrax. Some weird things happen. Some people try and kill him. He leaves Thrax. Some aliens from the future tell him that he is indeed the chosen one, and then he becomes the Autarch. He rules the land for about 10 years, and then he leaves on a spaceship and travels to a weird planet where he is judged, and then he brings the new sun back to Earth, and everybody lives happily ever after. I'm being very flippant with the plot because for the vast majority of the time spent reading this book, the plot wasn't my main source of entertainment or interest. Not until we get to about the second half of Earth of the New Sun, and then the plot is the best thing about it. The setting of the Book of the New Sun is, aesthetically at least, a declining, tired civilization. Medieval feeling, maybe, where the level of technology appears to be inferior to what we have right now. But we're so far in the future, it becomes obvious, there are lots of clues, that there are remains of unfathomable technology just lying around. Sometimes it's really obvious, like a portal to another dimension, an android, laser guns and flying cars. But the genius is in the execution. Severian is writing this for the people of his time. So why would he explain flying saucers and genetically modified horses and aliens walking among us? It's normal to him. And in many ways, Severian is the author of this book, not Gene Wolfe. What? So the plot, the setting, the language, the action itself is a mystery to discover, a puzzle to unlock. And I loved every second of it. Gene Wolfe intended these books to be read over and over again. So I do understand that if you arrived at the Book of the New Sun expecting a traditional fantasy quest, that you would be a bit pissed off at the obscure presentation. What the hell is going on? But I don't think it's that hard to grasp the ground level story, the day-to-day of this book. But I expect many people attempting this for the first time will experience quite a bit of what the hell is going on. When you reread this book, you will discover more layers and hopefully realise that what the hell is going on is a beautiful thing. I know loads of people that have read this book numerous times and will read it again many more times. People that write books and make podcasts about it, and they all still shrug their shoulders at certain points, all with a smile on their face. So the surface level story is relatively straightforward, relatively. But Gene Wolfe increases our exposure to the science fiction elements and the complexity of the plot as we go. He just has a unique twist on the way that he delivers it to our brains.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Podcast 24/7. Be sure to check out Podcast.
The writing, my favourite aspect of the in-the-moment reading experience. I really hope I have the words to convey just how much I loved it. Let's talk about prose. I believe that by definition, prose is the language in its most natural form. So without rhythm or flourish, kind of like the opposite of poetry. Did I get that right? In this case, the prose is the voice of Severian writing his memoirs. However, it's not that bloody simple, is it? We know from paying attention that these 4 books, the original Book of the New Sun, travelled back in time. Obviously Gene Wolfe just imagined this. They travelled back in time and they were quite hard to read, so he translated them as best he could. The Earth of the New Sun done the same, but the language is slightly different because now Severian is a bit older and wiser, and again it was translated by Wolfe. On top of all that, Severian is writing his memoirs from memory, claiming that this is how the events in the book took place. His brain, his consciousness changes as the story progresses. He's actually a different configuration of memories by the time we get to the end of the book. He even interacts with some of the people that he'll one day consume. Don't worry about it. And Gene Wolfe, the actual Gene Wolfe that's writing this book, balances all of that and passes it through these interacting filters and adjusts the prose accordingly. And as if that wasn't enough, Severian is an unreliable narrator. He's purposely vague when it suits him. He often depicts himself as a heroic stud, and sometimes he just lies and contradicts himself. Wolfe has to leave those breadcrumbs in the text just for us, so that we know all of that without it looking like Severian is showing his hand or breaking the fourth wall. So we never truly know what is really happening or what is complete bollocks. All of these things are about perspective, the volume and the clarity of information that's getting through to the reader after it's gone through that meat grinder of time, interpretation, and quite possibly propaganda. The language, I'm getting bogged down with definitions here. What many people refer to as the prose, the actual words used, the atmosphere created, is probably the best I've ever read. But why does that even matter? I don't judge a book solely on how complicated or dense the writing is. I don't need great prose if the story and the ideas are amazing. A lot of really good science fiction has shit writing. Now this is the bit that I really struggle to explain, so please bear with me. He paints a picture that is vivid because it's very close to poetry. Descriptions can be purple, but they're also practical. Severian is constantly reflecting on his own situation. So within this pseudo-historical account of events, we get a very personal character study. Everything I've just mentioned about the writing is just the toolkit, the ingredients for a great writer to tell a great story. And I've read a bunch of books that do this very successfully. The magic ingredient, and this is always just slightly out of reach, is the way that almost everything is slightly obscured from view. The balance of that execution is perfect, and it also evolves as we go through the series. The city could have been half constructed out of plastic and yellow glass. Severian could have had a completely different personality, or maybe never even existed at all. And as for the events that happen in the book, well, Severian is effectively writing his own gospel. Somehow, Gene Wolfe gives us just enough information to paint the landscape, describe the characters, and let us know kind of what the hell is going on. Just enough to pull us through the narrative. We have to fill in the gaps ourselves. It's so rewarding. You feel smart when you figure something out for yourself, but it's delightfully frustrating when you don't understand, because it makes you open your eyes and pay attention, and you instinctively know that it goes much, much deeper. Just like your mum. Alright, so we have this wonderfully crafted book. The technique is second to none. I had a blast reading every single page, and once all the pieces slot together, I'm in love with the plot. I can't stop thinking about it. But what does it all mean? I think it's important to point out that I follow my own interpretation, death of the author, birth of the reader concept, meaning I don't have to accept Gene Wolfe's intentions. That's how I think all art should be reviewed. We take the Book of the New Sun, we take my brain, and we squish them together, and a new thing is born. It'll probably look a lot like Brad Pitt with a massive tash. That doesn't mean that I go off on some weird tangent and throw away the whole Jesus thing that this book is clearly probably about. Not at all. I'm just not into so-called experts telling other readers that they didn't understand it because it doesn't line up with what they think Gene Wolfe was talking about. I'm saying that the debate should never end. My take is that this is an obvious parallel to the Messiah story. Severian does save the world, sort of, and he is the conciliator that is prophesied to return one day with a big cross on his back, his sword, and he is a very naughty boy. I think Wolfe wants us to
It's like he's playing a trick. He presents us with a puzzle that we think we've solved. This is a Bible analogy, but then he sidesteps that and shows us that Severian is an absolute piece of shit. He's not teaching anyone to be a better person. Or is this in fact an anti-religious story? An earth that has left God so far behind that its saviour is a lying rapist, and now we need faith more than ever. I think it's about all of those things. But just like the prose, it's a very personal thing. It's one man's journey from lowly apprentice to the king of the land to living God. And that's why you have to read Earth of the New Sun to get that full character arc. I'll leave you with this image, something that blows my mind every time I think about the book. The zooming out effect of ever deeper concentric layers of meaning, physical space and providence. We start with this relatively small local story about a guy wandering around, getting in trouble and banging chicks. Then it's sea monsters controlling and manipulating the politics of the land. And then it's about birthing a star and moving it across space and time to Earth. Further out, and it's interdimensional aliens uplifting humanity so that we can save the universe. And then the next universe, the secret history of time, how life can abide and survive an eternal chain of universes. And beyond even that, looking down on the whole thing, maybe then we can see the face of God. And the concentration of information and understanding fades the further out we go. Gene Wolfe knows that humanity, the reader, has limits. And all of this exists and overlaps at the same time in the same book. And then it shrinks all the way back down and it's a little time travel story about some people that done some stuff. I don't know how he pulled it off. It feels so chaotic a lot of the time, but it always unpicks itself. And you know that every word is exactly where it should be. It's miraculous. And all of this was written in his lunch break while he was making crisps. A score for the Book of the New Sun. Don't be silly. You can't score something that is beyond perfection. This is my #1 book of all time, and it lives rent-free in the pantheon. At the risk of sounding pretentious, this is the only book that I've ever read that I will completely disagree with other reviewers who don't think it's amazing. Any other book, you think Frankenstein is boring, you hate Ender's Game, The Left Hand of Darkness is overrated. Okay, I get it. Let's agree to disagree, that's fine. But if you don't love this, let's just say that that says more about you than it does about the book. Did you love the Book of the New Sun? Did you hate the Book of the New Sun? Oh, Judean People's Front. Let us know in the comments, please. Thank you very much for watching. There isn't another video to click on because we're right in the middle of one big, massive Book of the New Sun video. So just stay where you are and keep watching. Peace! So you've made it to the end, you've read all 5, yes, 5 books in the series, and you loved it. What could you possibly read next that will give you a similar experience or galvanise what you've just been exposed to? You could take inspiration from the man himself. Here's a quote from Gene Wolfe. "My definition of good literature is which can be read by an educated reader and reread with increased pleasure." So if we stay within the Book of the New Sun bubble for a while, you could, and definitely should, just read the whole thing again. It was written with the reread in mind. In my experience, the first read through, although great, was full of questions and half-baked theories. I loved the mystery, but it was the wonderful prose and the surface level story that impressed me most. The increased pleasure that Wolfe talks about came much later with illuminating foreshadowing and unlocking little puzzles, especially constructing more of that much bigger picture. What is the book actually about? When you're ready for some help,
And some people will remain purist and never read beyond the actual novels, which is admirable, but when you're ready, you have options if you want to go deeper. LEXICON URTHUS, a dictionary for the Earth cycle by Michael Andre-Driussi. It's an A to Z of character profiles, a glossary of names and terms, maps, synopsis, and so much more. Meticulously researched and essential for any would-be Book of the New Sun connoisseur. Solar Labyrinth, exploring Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun by Robert Borski. It's a collection of essays theorising many of the more head-scratching conundrums. And there is a plethora of websites and podcasts offering hand-holding, explanations, intricate synopsis and discussion. In particular, Rereading Wolfe, which goes chapter by chapter, full spoilers for the entire series, encouraging theories and debate. And Alzabo Soup, also breaking down each book one slice at a time, but more suited as a spoiler-free companion as you read along, and clarity for the rest of us. In my opinion, the real joy of obsessing over the Book of the New Sun is using this vast bank of knowledge and enthusiasm and moulding your own relationship with the text. Death of the author. The true meaning comes from the reader's interpretation. Anyway, further reading. You could just continue. The Book of the Long Sun is a 4-novel series set in the same universe as the Book of the New Sun. It's a separate story, but it has tenuous links. And then that story continues in the 3-part Book of the Short Sun. The whole thing is known as the solar cycle. So that's 12 novels and a handful of short stories and essays. Gene Wolfe wrote over 60 novels and short stories from the 1970s to just a few years ago. Among the best received and well regarded are The Fifth Head of Cerberus. This is published as a little collection of 3 novellas. The Fifth Head of Cerberus, a story by John V. Marsh, that's actually the name of the novella, and VRT. They are absolutely connected and together form one complicated novel. I would say that Fifth Head is even more challenging than the Book of the New Sun in places. It has that same mesmerising style, but the rewards for paying attention and rereading are huge. It's brilliant. The Wizard Knight. Typical Wolfe displaying a traditional fantasy story with dragons, questing and magic swords, but with the twist of linking it to the modern world and shrouding the tale with dream logic and fragmented storytelling. Peace is a psychological fantasy ghost story. It's probably best if I paraphrase from Gene Wolfe himself. The basic idea is that a man has died and he is haunting his own mind, his own past. If there's a tree on a grave, when the tree falls, the falling of the tree releases a ghost on the earth. In Peace, that ghost prowls through the memories throughout the book. Critics have always disagreed and debated what this book is actually about and what happens. So why don't you give it a try and add to that pile of opinions. And the Soldier series. It's set in ancient Greece. And it's about a soldier, obviously, who suffers a head injury and has both forms of amnesia. So he can't recall old memories and he can't make new memories. So it's a bit like Memento, but double Memento. We read his account of his travels and how he makes sense of the world around him, of course with a twist. He can sometimes communicate with the gods. This video, well, all of our videos actually, cost a lot of time and some money to make. Money that we don't have. You can support this operation by donating on Buy Me a Coffee, which is an online tipping service. Get yourself some merch over at the merch store, or you can join the cult on Patreon and gain access to our exclusive Discord and the podcast, Radio Death Cult. Links to all that good stuff in the description. Thank you so much. There are quite a few references to other authors and works in the Book of the New Sun, but none more prominent than Jorge Luis Borges. He influenced Wolfe so heavily that Oltan, the librarian of Nessus, is a reference to Borges himself. His short stories deal with the concepts of infinity and thought experiments, and the complications that arise when both of those are expressed. Nothing is quite like the Book of the New Sun, but I do have a list of books that has a similar style or setting, and at least attempts some of the same narrative flourishes. The Dying Earth by Jack Vance has a very similar science fiction in fantasy clothing vibe. It too is set in the far future where the sun is dying and humanity is on its last legs. What first appears to be wizards using traditional fantasy magic and spells is mostly explained to actually be mega advanced scientific applications. It's a fascinating texture of a medieval style existence and aesthetic, but camping in the ruins of once great civilizations and technology. The Sorcerer of the Will Deeps by K. Ashanti Wilson. It's about the sorcerer or demigod hired to accompany a trader's caravan through the treacherous Will Deeps, a dangerous weave of shifting worlds that none but the gods dare enter safely. It sounds like weird fantasy, but there may be something else going on as well. Gorgeous prose and deep, interrelated character profiles. The Terra Ignota series by Ada Palmer, not a Dying Earth story, but set a few hundred years in the future with amazing technology, while also echoing back to the Renaissance, the Roman Empire, the Enlightenment, and everything in between. This perfectly suits that Gene Wolfe quote, "My definition of great literature is that which can be read by an educated person and reread with increased pleasure," right? I didn't get all of the references, well I didn't get many of them to be honest, but I still found it extremely rewarding and positively challenging, and it even has a self-confessed unreliable narrator. The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. This is one of Pynchon's shorter works and a great introduction to his literary puzzles. If you loved following Severian through seemingly random encounters with people who obliquely explained scientific, economic and historical concepts to him, you'll enjoy watching the main character Ida Pamas do the same thing as she searches for a shadow post office. There's even a confusing play. 100 Years of Solitude. Gabriel Garcia Marquez loves to talk about families, emotional attachment and thematic events that loop back on themselves in this class work of magical realism. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke is a short but punchy novel about a character called Piranesi who lives in a world of infinite halls and rooms lined with statues. He thinks that he's always lived in that place and that there's only 15 people in the whole world. Piranesi records every day in his journal, but flicking back through the pages, he can't even remember writing the old entries. That's all I'm saying. And finally, I think I need to mention Malazan or Malazan, Book of the Fallen. It's the fantasy series that always gets put on the meta shelf right next to the Book of the New Sun. Fans of Wolfe seem to be drawn to this series by the lack of traditional fantasy storytelling. It's that pay close attention and get big rewards kind of thing. Personally, I'm only halfway through the second book, but I already see the parallels. I get why the admirers of Malazan will reread this over and over again. Of course, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I didn't even get to talk about Le Guin, Michael Moorcock, Jeff Vandermeer, Mervyn Peake. For so many more recommendations of a similar oeuvre, the comments section of this video and the Media Death Cult Discord will be fertile hunting ground.